The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Sergeant Marcus Chun checked his equipment one final time. The 28-year-old combat medic had been deployed for 8 months, and this patrol felt different somehow. Maybe it was the unusual quiet that had settled over their forward operating base, or maybe it was the intelligence reports about increased Taliban activity in the region. Either way, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that today would change everything. Marcus had joined the Army straight out of high school in rural Montana. His grandfather had served in Vietnam, his father in Desert Storm, and Marcus felt the pull of military service from an early age. What set him apart wasn't just his medical training, but his stubborn refusal to follow conventional wisdom. His squad mates often joked that Marcus would probably try to treat a gunshot wound with duct tape and positive thinking if that's all he had available. The patrol consisted of 12 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division, tasked with checking on a remote village that had gone silent for 3 days. Intelligence suggested the Taliban might have moved through the area, but satellite imagery showed no obvious signs of conflict. The mission was classified as routine reconnaissance, but in Afghanistan, routine missions had a way of becoming anything but routine. Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez briefed the team at 0600 hours. We're looking at a 6-hour round trip through mountainous terrain. The village sits in a valley about 15 clicks northeast of our position. Weather reports show clear skies, but temperatures will drop fast once the sun goes down. We need to be back before nightfall. Marcus listened carefully while organizing his medical supplies. He carried twice the normal load of medical equipment, a habit that had earned him both praise and criticism from his superiors. Some called it excessive preparation. Marcus called it being ready for reality. He had learned early in his deployment that the difference between life and death often came down to having the right supplies at the right moment. The team moved out at 0700, following a well-worn path that wound through rocky terrain. The landscape was breathtaking and deadly in equal measure. Towering peaks surrounded them on all sides, creating natural corridors that could become death traps if enemy forces controlled the high ground. Marcus stayed alert, scanning both the terrain ahead and his fellow soldiers for any signs of trouble. About 2 hours into the patrol, they encountered their first challenge. The path ahead had been washed out by recent rains, leaving a gap too wide to jump and too deep to climb down safely. Standard protocol would have been to turn back and find an alternate route, adding several hours to their mission. But Specialist James Park, their demolitions expert, had spotted what looked like an old goat trail that cut across the mountainside. That trail hasn't been maintained in years, Lieutenant Rodriguez observed through her binoculars. It could be unstable. Marcus studied the narrow path carved into the rock face. It was barely wide enough for one person, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet on one side. Military doctrine clearly stated that such routes should be avoided unless absolutely necessary. But Marcus had grown up hiking mountain trails in Montana, and something about this particular path looked familiar. I've seen trails like this before, Marcus said quietly. Herders use them to move goats between seasonal pastures. They're actually more stable than they look because they follow natural rock formations. The lieutenant considered their options. Turning back would mean aborting the mission, which could have serious consequences if the village was indeed in trouble. The alternate route would add 6 hours to their journey, putting them well into nightfall territory. After consulting with her sergeant, she made the decision to attempt the goat trail. Marcus volunteered to go first, carrying a rope that the others could use for additional security. As he stepped onto the narrow ledge, he felt the solid rock beneath his feet and knew his instincts had been correct. The trail was ancient, but well-constructed, following the natural contours of the mountain in a way that distributed weight evenly. One by one, the patrol made their way across the treacherous path. It took nearly an hour to get all 12 soldiers safely to the other side, but they had avoided a potentially mission-ending delay. As they regrouped, Marcus noticed that several of his teammates were looking at him with new respect. Breaking standard protocol had paid off, but he knew that success today didn't guarantee the same outcome tomorrow. The descent into the valley where the village was located proved to be another challenge. The terrain was loose shale that shifted underfoot with every step. Standard procedure called for using established switchback trails to minimize the risk of landslides, but those trails would have taken the miles out of their way. Marcus studied the slope carefully, noting how the loose rock lay over more solid stone beneath. He remembered a technique his grandfather had taught him during hunting trips in the Rockies. Instead of fighting the loose rock, you could use it to your advantage by controlling small, deliberate slides. "There's a way to get down this slope safely," Marcus told the lieutenant. "But it means doing the opposite of what our training manual says." Lieutenant Rodriguez had been in Afghanistan long enough to know that textbook solutions didn't always work in real-world situations. She had also begun to trust Marcus's unconventional instincts. "Show me," she said. Marcus demonstrated the technique on a small section of the slope. Instead of trying to find solid footing with each step, he allowed his feet to slide in a controlled manner, using his momentum and body weight to maintain balance. It looked dangerous to the untrained eye, but it was actually much safer than trying to fight the natural movement of the loose rock. The entire patrol successfully descended using Marcus's technique, reaching the valley floor in half the time it would have taken using conventional methods. They had now saved several hours by breaking standard protocols twice, but Marcus knew that their real challenges were still ahead. As they approached the village, everything appeared normal from a distance. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and they could see people moving about their daily activities. But something felt wrong to Marcus. The sounds weren't right. There were no children's voices, no animal sounds, no normal bustle of village life. Lieutenant Rodriguez called for a halt about 200 meters from the village perimeter. Through binoculars, she confirmed what Marcus's instincts had already told him. The people they could see were all adult males, and they were all carrying weapons. "It's an ambush," she whispered into her radio. "The village has been compromised." Standard military doctrine in this situation was clear: establish a defensive perimeter, call for backup, and wait for reinforcements before engaging. With only 12 soldiers against an unknown number of enemy combatants in prepared positions, a direct assault would be suicide. But as Marcus scanned the village through his binoculars, he spotted something that changed everything. In one of the buildings, he could see what looked like civilians, women, and children being held against their will. The original villagers hadn't fled or been killed. They were being used as human shields. "We can't wait for backup," Marcus told the lieutenant. "Those people won't survive that long." Lieutenant Rodriguez understood the implication. Even if they called for immediate support, it would take hours for reinforcements to reach their position. By then, the Taliban fighters would either have escaped or killed their hostages to eliminate witnesses. Marcus began studying the village layout with new eyes. Instead of seeing it as a tactical nightmare, he started looking for unconventional approaches that might give them an advantage. The village sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by hills that provided excellent defensive positions for the enemy. But that same geography might also work against them if approached correctly. "What are you thinking, Chun?" the lieutenant asked. Marcus pointed to a drainage ditch that ran along the eastern edge of the village. It had been dug years earlier to channel rainwater away from the buildings, but it was deep enough to provide concealment for approaching soldiers. The problem was that it led directly into the most heavily defended part of the village. "Everyone will expect us to avoid that ditch because it's obviously dangerous," Marcus explained. "But sometimes the most dangerous approach is actually the safest because no one expects it." Lieutenant Rodriguez considered the plan. It went against everything they had been taught about small unit tactics. But she had seen Marcus's unconventional thinking work twice already today, and the lives of innocent civilians hung in the balance. As the patrol prepared for what would become the most important mission of their deployment, Marcus checked his medical supplies one final time. He had a feeling that before this day was over, he would need every skill he had learned, both from military training and from growing up in the mountains of Montana. The rules of survival were about to be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, casting the valley in golden light that would soon give way to the dangerous shadows of evening. Time was running out, and conventional wisdom would have to give way to desperate courage and unconventional thinking. Marcus took a deep breath of the thin mountain air and prepared to lead his team into a situation that would either save innocent lives or cost them their own. In the mountains of Afghanistan, there was often no middle ground between heroism and tragedy. Today would determine which side of that line they would fall on. The drainage ditch was deeper than Marcus had expected, but that worked to their advantage. As he led the patrol through the muddy channel, he could hear voices from the village above them. The Taliban fighters were speaking in hushed tones, but their confidence was evident. They believed they controlled the situation completely. Marcus held up his hand, signaling the patrol to stop. Through a crack in the concrete that lined the drainage ditch, he could see into the main village square. At least 8 armed men were visible, but Marcus suspected there were more hidden in the buildings. What concerned him most was the systematic way they had positioned themselves. This wasn't a random group of fighters. It was a well-organized unit that had been planning this operation. Lieutenant Rodriguez crawled up beside Marcus and peered through the same crack. "They're professionals," she whispered. "This isn't some opportunistic raid." Marcus nodded, his mind racing through possibilities. Professional Taliban fighters would be harder to surprise, but they would also follow predictable tactical patterns. They would expect any rescue attempt to come from the high ground around the village, where American forces could use their superior training and equipment to maximum advantage. "They're watching all the conventional approach routes," Marcus observed, "but they're not watching below ground." The drainage system was more extensive than they had initially realized. Marcus could see that it connected to several buildings in the village, designed to carry water away during the seasonal floods that plagued the region. If they could access those connections, they might be able to get inside the village without being detected. But first, they needed more information about the enemy positions and the location of the hostages. Marcus volunteered to conduct a reconnaissance mission alone, despite Lieutenant Rodriguez's initial objections. "I grew up stalking deer through forests that looked like this," Marcus said quietly. "I can get close enough to gather intelligence without being spotted." The lieutenant reluctantly agreed, knowing that their current position was untenable. They couldn't stay in the drainage ditch indefinitely, and they couldn't attack without better information about what they were facing. Marcus removed his helmet and most of his gear, keeping only his sidearm, medical supplies, and communication equipment. He had learned from his grandfather that sometimes survival meant making yourself smaller and quieter, not bigger and more heavily armed. Moving through the brush along the edge of the village required every skill Marcus had learned during his childhood in Montana. He placed each step carefully, testing the ground before committing his full weight. He avoided branches that might snap back and create noise. Most importantly, he moved slowly and patiently, resisting the urge to rush. As he got closer to the village buildings, Marcus could hear more details of the conversations taking place among the Taliban fighters. Although he didn't speak their language fluently, he had picked up enough during his deployment to understand key phrases. What he heard made his blood run cold. The fighters were discussing their timeline. They planned to execute the male villagers at sunset and take the women and children with them when they departed. This wasn't just a raid. It was a coordinated operation to kidnap potential hostages for future use. Marcus counted at least 12 enemy combatants, making the odds exactly even in terms of numbers. But the Taliban fighters had superior positioning, intimate knowledge of the village layout, and human shields to protect them. By any conventional military assessment, a direct assault would be a massacre. But as Marcus studied the village from his concealed position, he began to notice things that conventional military thinking might overlook. The Taliban fighters were positioned to repel attacks from above, but their fields of fire created blind spots that could be exploited by someone approaching from unexpected angles. More importantly, the fighters were confident enough in their defensive positions that they had become somewhat complacent. They weren't maintaining constant vigilance, instead rotating their attention between watching for threats and managing their hostages. Marcus carefully noted the position of each enemy fighter he could identify, as well as the buildings where civilians appeared to be held. The hostages were being kept in 3 separate locations, which would complicate any rescue attempt. Standard protocol would be to focus on one group at a time, but that would give the enemy time to react and potentially kill the other hostages. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Marcus realized that conventional tactics weren't just inadvisable in this situation. They were impossible. Saving all the hostages would require simultaneous action at multiple locations, coordinated timing, and a level of unpredictability that no military manual could provide. Marcus made his way back to the drainage ditch, where Lieutenant Rodriguez and the rest of the patrol were waiting anxiously. As he briefed them on what he had observed, he could see the grim realization settling over their faces. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy that held all the tactical advantages. "There is one possibility," Marcus said after completing his situation report. "But it means doing everything wrong according to our training." He spread out a rough map of the village that he had sketched during his reconnaissance. Instead of proposing a coordinated military assault, Marcus suggested what could only be described as controlled chaos. "We split into 4 teams," he explained. "Each team approaches from a different direction at exactly the same time. We don't try to maintain communication or coordination once the action starts. Instead, we create so much confusion that the enemy can't establish effective fire control." Lieutenant Rodriguez stared at the plan in disbelief. "You're suggesting we deliberately break unit cohesion and attack simultaneously from positions where we can't support each other?" "That's exactly what I'm suggesting," Marcus replied, "because that's exactly what they won't expect us to do." The plan violated fundamental principles of military tactics. Small units were supposed to maintain cohesion, establish fire superiority, and advance systematically. Marcus was proposing that they abandon all of these principles in favor of creating maximum confusion. But as the lieutenant studied the village layout and considered their limited options, she began to see the logic in Marcus's madness. Conventional tactics would fail because the enemy was prepared for conventional tactics. Only by doing the unexpected could they hope to succeed. The patrol was divided into 3 assault teams of 3 soldiers each, plus Marcus operating alone as a 4th element. Each team was assigned specific objectives and routes of approach that would minimize the risk of friendly fire while maximizing the enemy's confusion. Team Alpha, led by Lieutenant Rodriguez, would approach from the north using the drainage system to get as close as possible to the building where the largest group of hostages was being held. Team Bravo would circle around to the east and create a diversion to draw enemy attention. Team Charlie would approach from the south, targeting the Taliban fighters who were positioned to watch the traditional approach routes. Marcus would operate independently, using his medical training and small unit skills to move between the teams as needed. His job was to provide medical support and to exploit any opportunities that arose during the chaos of the assault. As they prepared for the attack, Marcus distributed his medical supplies among the 3 teams, keeping only the most essential items for himself. He knew that once the shooting started, he might need to treat wounded soldiers or civilians under fire, possibly with limited resources. "Remember," Marcus told his teammates as they prepared to move out, "once we start this, there's no going back. We can't call for backup, we can't retreat, and we can't hesitate. Everything depends on speed, surprise, and staying unpredictable." The sun was beginning to touch the western peaks when the 4 elements moved into their starting positions. Marcus checked his watch. They had agreed to begin the assault at exactly 1800 hours, giving them just enough daylight to complete the operation before darkness made coordination impossible. As Marcus moved into his position, he reflected on how far they had strayed from standard military procedure. They were about to attempt a rescue mission using tactics that would probably result in court-martial if they survived to face military justice. But the alternative was to let innocent people die while following rules that were written for different situations. At 1,759 hours, Marcus keyed his radio for the final time before radio silence would begin. All teams check in. Alpha ready. Bravo ready. Charlie ready. Marcus took a deep breath and looked at his watch as the second hand approached the 12. In 60 seconds, they would either save a dozen innocent lives or die trying. There would be no middle ground, no partial success, and no second chances. Execute, Marcus whispered into his radio, and then turn it off. The most unconventional military operation in the history of the 82nd Airborne Division was about to begin. The first explosion came from the east, exactly as planned. Team Bravo had detonated a small charge near the village entrance, creating a diversion that immediately drew the attention of half the Taliban fighters. Marcus watched through his binoculars as enemy combatants rushed toward the sound, leaving their prepared positions to investigate what they assumed was the beginning of a conventional assault. Team Alpha moved through the drainage system like water flowing downhill, silent and fast. Lieutenant Rodriguez had embraced Marcus's unconventional thinking completely, leading her team through routes that no military manual would recommend. They emerged from a culvert directly beneath the building where the largest group of hostages was being held. Marcus waited 30 seconds after the diversion began, then started his own movement toward the village center. Instead of approaching tactically with his weapon at the ready, he walked normally, counting on the confusion and poor lighting to make enemy fighters assume he was one of their own until it was too late. The gamble worked better than he had dared to hope. A Taliban fighter spotted Marcus approaching and actually waved him forward, assuming he was a comrade responding to the explosion. By the time the fighter realized his mistake, Marcus was close enough to take him down silently with his combat knife. Team Charlie began their assault from the south precisely on schedule, but they immediately encountered unexpected resistance. The Taliban had positioned a machine gun team in a location that Marcus hadn't spotted during his reconnaissance. The distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through the valley, and Marcus knew his teammates were in serious trouble. Without hesitation, Marcus abandoned his original plan and sprinted toward Team Charlie's position. As he ran, he could hear the steady rhythm of the machine gun and the sporadic return fire from his outnumbered teammates. They were pinned down and taking casualties. Marcus approached the machine gun position from its blind side, using the village buildings as cover. The Taliban fighters were so focused on suppressing Team Charlie that they didn't notice Marcus until he was directly behind them. He eliminated both fighters with precise shots before they could turn their weapon around. But the damage had already been done. When Marcus reached Team Charlie's position, he found Corporal Williams with a serious leg wound and Private First Class Jackson unconscious from a head injury. Standard medical protocol called for immediate evacuation of wounded soldiers, but leaving now would doom the hostages and possibly the other teams. Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for years afterward. Instead of treating his wounded teammates according to medical guidelines, he provided just enough first aid to stabilize them and continued with the mission. He left them hidden behind a stone wall with instructions to stay put until the fighting was over. "This isn't over," Marcus told Corporal Williams as he applied a pressure bandage to the leg wound. "I'm coming back for you." Williams grabbed Marcus's arm with surprising strength. "Go save those people," he whispered. "We'll be fine." Marcus knew Williams was probably lying, but he also knew that stopping to provide proper medical care would result in everyone dying. He left his wounded teammates with a supply of morphine and his personal promise to return, then headed toward the sound of gunfire coming from the center of the village. Team Alpha had successfully breached the building where the hostages were being held, but they had walked into a trap. The Taliban had anticipated that any rescue attempt would focus on the largest group of civilians, so they had turned the hostage location into a killing zone. Lieutenant Rodriguez and her team were trapped inside the building with the very people they were trying to save. Marcus could hear the firefight raging inside the building as he approached. The Taliban fighters outside were preventing Team Alpha from escaping, while those inside were using the hostages as human shields to prevent the American soldiers from returning effective fire. Once again, Marcus abandoned conventional tactics. Instead of trying to assault the building or establish fire superiority, he climbed onto the roof using a route that would have been impossible for a soldier carrying standard equipment. His decision to travel light was paying off in ways he couldn't have anticipated. From the roof, Marcus could see into the building through several openings. The situation inside was even worse than he had feared. Lieutenant Rodriguez had been wounded, and Sergeant Martinez was trying to protect a dozen terrified civilians while fighting off Taliban fighters who were using the confusion to their advantage. Marcus did something that no military manual would ever recommend. He jumped through the roof, opening directly into the middle of the firefight. He landed hard on the floor of the building, but his unexpected arrival created exactly the kind of confusion that his plan depended on. The Taliban fighters inside the building had been focused on the American soldiers they could see. They never expected another enemy to drop from above. Marcus's surprise entrance allowed Sergeant Martinez to gain fire superiority for the crucial seconds needed to protect the civilians. Working together, Marcus and Martinez eliminated the remaining Taliban fighters inside the building, but they could hear more enemy combatants approaching from outside. The diversion created by Team Bravo was wearing off, and the remaining Taliban fighters were beginning to coordinate a counterattack. "We need to get these people out of here now," Marcus told Martinez as he assessed Lieutenant Rodriguez's wounds. She had taken shrapnel from a grenade explosion and was losing blood, but she was still conscious and able to move. The problem was that there were too many hostages to move quickly, and some of them were elderly or injured. Standard evacuation procedures would take too long and expose everyone to enemy fire. Marcus needed another unconventional solution. Looking around the building, Marcus noticed that it had been built over part of the drainage system he had used to approach the village. If they could access the tunnels from inside, they might be able to evacuate the hostages without exposing them to enemy fire. Using his combat knife and a small explosive charge borrowed from Martinez, Marcus opened a hole in the floor that led to the drainage tunnel below. The opening was barely large enough for one person at a time, but it provided a route to safety that the Taliban fighters couldn't anticipate or counter. One by one, the hostages were lowered into the tunnel and guided toward the village outskirts. The process was agonizingly slow, made more difficult by the fact that some of the civilians were too frightened to understand what was happening. Marcus found himself using a combination of gestures, broken local language, and sheer determination to convince people to trust him. As the last hostage disappeared into the tunnel, Marcus could hear Taliban fighters breaking down the door of the building. Martinez had used furniture and debris to create a barricade, but it wouldn't hold much longer. "Go," Martinez told Marcus. "I'll hold them off." Marcus shook his head. "We all go together or nobody goes." Lieutenant Rodriguez, despite her injuries, made the decision for them. "That's an order, Chun. Get those people to safety. Martinez, and I will be right behind you." Marcus knew it was probably a lie, but he also knew that arguing would waste precious time that could mean the difference between life and death for the civilians. He dropped into the tunnel and began herding the hostages towards safety, leaving his wounded teammates to face overwhelming odds. The drainage tunnel was partially flooded and filled with debris, making movement difficult for the terrified civilians. Marcus found himself carrying elderly villagers, supporting injured children, and constantly encouraging people who wanted to give up. His medical training helped him identify those who needed immediate assistance, but his survival skills were what kept them all moving forward. Behind them, Marcus could hear the sound of intense fighting as Martinez and Lieutenant Rodriguez held off the Taliban fighters. The sound of American weapons was becoming less frequent, replaced by the chatter of enemy automatic weapons. Marcus knew what that meant, but he forced himself to focus on the mission. When they finally emerged from the drainage system at the edge of the village, Marcus counted heads and realized they had successfully evacuated all 12 hostages. But the cost of that success was becoming clear. Team Alpha was no longer responding to radio calls. Team Bravo had gone silent after their initial diversion, and Team Charlie was wounded and trapped. Marcus faced the hardest decision of his military career. He could lead the hostages to safety and call for extraction, completing the primary mission successfully. Or he could leave the civilians in a relatively safe location and go back for his teammates, knowing that doing so would violate every principle of tactical thinking and probably result in his own death. As he looked at the faces of the people he had just saved, grandparents, mothers, children who would grow up because of what his team had sacrificed, Marcus realized there was really no choice at all. He had made promises to wounded soldiers, and he intended to keep them. "Stay here," he told the civilians in what little of their language he knew, gesturing toward a rocky area that would provide cover from the village. "Americans come soon." Then Marcus turned around and headed back into the valley, where the sound of gunfire was growing sporadic and the shadows were getting longer. He was about to attempt something that would have been considered suicidal by any reasonable military standard: a one-man rescue mission against overwhelming odds, conducted with limited ammunition and medical supplies in territory controlled by the enemy. But Marcus Chun had been breaking the rules of survival all day, and he wasn't about to stop now. The village had gone eerily quiet by the time Marcus made it back to the drainage system. The sporadic gunfire had stopped completely, replaced by the sound of voices speaking in urgent tones. Marcus couldn't understand most of what was being said, but the tone told him everything he needed to know. The Taliban fighters were regrouping and searching for survivors. Marcus's first priority was reaching Team Charlie's position, where he had left Corporal Williams and Private Jackson. Moving through the drainage tunnels in reverse was even more difficult than the original evacuation, but it provided concealment that would have been impossible above ground. When he emerged near the stone wall where he had hidden his wounded teammates, Marcus felt his heart sink. The position had been discovered. Bloodstains on the ground told a story that Marcus didn't want to read, but there were no bodies. Either his teammates had been captured, or they had managed to move to a different location. Marcus studied the area carefully, using tracking skills his grandfather had taught him during hunting trips in Montana. The blood trail led away from the original hiding spot toward a cluster of abandoned animal pens on the outskirts of the village. It was exactly the kind of place that wounded soldiers might choose for a temporary refuge. Following the trail required moving across open ground that was potentially under enemy observation. Standard military procedure would be to call for backup, establish overwatch, and approach systematically. Marcus had no backup to call, no overwatch to establish, and no time for systematic approaches. Instead, he used the same patient stalking techniques that had served him during his reconnaissance earlier in the day. He moved slowly and carefully, using every piece of available cover while staying alert for signs of enemy activity. The blood trail was easy to follow, but it also meant his teammates were badly hurt. Marcus found them in the third animal pen he checked. Corporal Williams was unconscious from blood loss, and Private Jackson had regained consciousness but was showing signs of serious head trauma. Neither soldier was in any condition to move under their own power, and both needed immediate medical attention that Marcus wasn't equipped to provide. "Chun," Jackson's voice was barely a whisper. "Thought you were dead." "Not yet," Marcus replied, already assessing their injuries. William's leg wound had reopened and was bleeding heavily despite the field dressing Marcus had applied earlier. Jackson's head injury was more serious than Marcus had initially realized, with signs of possible internal bleeding. Marcus faced another impossible decision. Both soldiers needed evacuation to a proper medical facility within hours, or they would die. But moving them would require exposing all three of them to enemy fire, and Marcus still hadn't located the other members of his patrol. "Where are Rodriguez and Martinez?" Marcus asked Jackson. Jackson's eyes had trouble focusing, but he managed to point toward the center of the village. Building collapsed. Explosion. Couldn't get to them. Marcus felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. If the building had collapsed with his teammates inside, they were probably already dead. But probably wasn't the same as certainly. And Marcus had made promises to people who were counting on him. "I'm going to get you both out of here," Marcus told his wounded teammates. "But first I need to check on the others." Williams regained consciousness briefly, gripping Marcus's arm with surprising strength. "Don't leave us," he whispered. Marcus looked into his teammates' eyes and saw the fear that every wounded soldier experiences when facing the possibility of being abandoned in enemy territory. It was a fear that Marcus understood completely, but it was also a fear he couldn't let control his decisions. "I'll be back," Marcus promised. "I've got medical supplies hidden nearby that might help. Give me 30 minutes. It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that might keep his teammates alive by giving them hope. Marcus left them with his remaining morphine and what little water he had, then set out to find Lieutenant Rodriguez and Sergeant Martinez. The building where Team Alpha had made their last stand was indeed partially collapsed. A Taliban rocket-propelled grenade had brought down most of the roof, creating a pile of rubble that would take heavy equipment to clear. Marcus could see no way that anyone trapped inside could have survived. But as he studied the debris, Marcus noticed something that gave him hope. The collapse pattern suggested that parts of the building might still be intact below ground level. If Rodriguez and Martinez had been able to reach the basement or foundation area, they might have survived the collapse. Marcus began moving stones and debris by hand, working as quietly as possible to avoid attracting attention. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the need for stealth, but Marcus had experience with manual labor from his childhood on a Montana ranch. After 20 minutes of careful excavation, Marcus heard something that made his heart race, a faint tapping sound coming from beneath the rubble. It was too rhythmic to be natural, too purposeful to be coincidental. Someone was alive under there, and they were trying to communicate. Marcus tapped back on a piece of concrete, using a simple code that all members of his patrol would recognize. The response was immediate and unmistakable: Morse code for help. The rescue operation required the kind of improvised engineering that no military manual could teach. Marcus needed to create an opening large enough to extract wounded soldiers without causing further collapse of the unstable rubble pile. Using a combination of physics principles he had learned in high school and practical knowledge gained from building construction projects on his family's ranch, Marcus began creating a careful excavation. The work was slow and dangerous. Every stone Marcus moved could potentially trigger a larger collapse that would kill anyone still alive below. But doing nothing would certainly result in his teammates' deaths. So Marcus continued working despite the risk. As he worked, Marcus could hear Taliban fighters moving through other parts of the village. They were conducting a systematic search for surviving American soldiers, and it was only a matter of time before they reached the collapsed building. Marcus needed to complete the rescue before that happened. After another 30 minutes of careful work, Marcus had opened a gap large enough to see into the space below. Lieutenant Rodriguez was alive, but unconscious, trapped under a fallen beam that Marcus couldn't move alone. Sergeant Martinez was awake and alert, but his legs were pinned by debris. "Chun." Martinez's voice was weak, but clear. "How many civilians did we save?" "All of them," Marcus replied, already planning how to extract his teammates from their underground prison. 12 hostages safe and accounted for. The expression that crossed Martinez's face was worth every risk Marcus had taken. Despite being trapped under tons of rubble with serious injuries, the sergeant smiled when he heard that their mission had been successful. But Marcus's relief was short-lived. He could hear voices approaching the building, and they were speaking in the language of the Taliban fighters. The enemy search teams were getting closer, and Marcus was running out of time. The extraction would require breaking even more rules of military procedure. Marcus needed to move both soldiers through an opening that was barely large enough for one person, while maintaining the structural stability of the rubble pile and avoiding detection by enemy forces. It should have been impossible, Marcus started with Martinez, who was conscious and could assist with his own rescue. Using a combination of ropes, leverage, and careful debris removal, Marcus managed to free the sergeant from his underground trap. Martinez had serious leg injuries that would make walking impossible, but he was alive and mobile enough to help with Rodriguez's extraction. Lieutenant Rodriguez's rescue was more complicated. She was unconscious and trapped under a beam that weighed several hundred pounds. Moving it would require strength that Marcus didn't have and equipment that wasn't available. Once again, conventional solutions were inadequate for an unconventional problem. Marcus remembered a technique he had seen his grandfather use to move fallen trees that were too heavy for manual lifting. By using a series of smaller pieces of wood as levers and fulcrums, it was possible to lift enormous weights with minimal force. The principle was simple physics, but applying it in a collapsed building while avoiding enemy detection required precision and luck. Working together, Marcus and Martinez managed to lift the beam enough for Marcus to pull Rodriguez to safety. She regained consciousness as they were moving her, confused and disoriented but alive. The extraction had taken nearly an hour, and Marcus could now hear Taliban fighters searching buildings very close to their position. Marcus faced his most complex logistics challenge yet. He had 4 wounded teammates scattered across the village, no reliable means of communication, and enemy forces actively searching for them. Moving everyone to safety would require multiple trips through hostile territory, and each movement increased the risk of detection. But Marcus had learned throughout this deployment that sometimes the most direct approach was actually the most effective. Instead of trying to move his teammates individually, he decided to gather everyone at a single location and attempt one coordinated evacuation. The location he chose was the same drainage system that had served them well throughout the day. It provided concealment, multiple escape routes, and a path that led away from the village toward the surrounding hills. The challenge would be getting 4 wounded soldiers to that location without being spotted by the enemy search teams. As darkness began to fall over the Afghan mountains, Marcus prepared for what would be the most dangerous phase of his improvised rescue mission. He had saved 12 civilian hostages by breaking conventional military rules all day. Now he needed to save his teammates by breaking even more rules and hoping that luck would continue to favor the unprepared. The gathering darkness provided both opportunity and danger as Marcus began the most challenging phase of his rescue mission. Taliban fighters were still conducting their search, but the poor visibility would make it harder for them to spot movement. At the same time, moving wounded soldiers through unfamiliar terrain in the dark carried its own risks. Marcus's plan required 3 separate trips through hostile territory. First, he would move Lieutenant Rodriguez and Sergeant Martinez from the collapsed building to the drainage system. Then, he would retrieve Corporal Williams and Private Jackson from their hiding place in the animal pens. Finally, he would guide all 4 wounded soldiers through the drainage tunnels to extraction point outside the village. Each phase of the plan violated fundamental principles of combat medicine and small unit tactics. Military doctrine called for treating wounded soldiers at the point of injury and evacuating them as quickly as possible. Marcus was doing exactly the opposite, moving critically injured people multiple times and exposing them to additional risk. But conventional medical procedures assumed the availability of resources that Marcus simply didn't have. There were no medical evacuation helicopters, no stretcher teams, and no secure evacuation routes. Marcus was working with the resources available to him, which meant improvising solutions that would have horrified his medical training instructors. The movement of Rodriguez and Martinez went more smoothly than Marcus had dared to hope. Both soldiers were able to move short distances with assistance, and the route to the drainage system was relatively clear of enemy activity. Marcus used a fireman's carry technique for the unconscious periods when Rodriguez couldn't move under her own power, and Martinez helped by serving as a lookout during rest stops. When they reached the drainage tunnel entrance, Marcus established a temporary aid station using his remaining medical supplies. He couldn't provide the level of care that his teammates needed, but he could stabilize their conditions enough to survive the evacuation that lay ahead. "How bad are Williams and Jackson?" Martinez asked as Marcus worked on Rodriguez's wounds. "Williams lost a lot of blood, and Jackson has a serious head injury," Marcus replied honestly. "They both need surgery that I can't provide." Martinez understood the implication. Time was running out for all of them, but especially for the teammates who were still trapped in the village. Every minute of delay decreased their chances of survival. The second phase of the rescue required Marcus to leave Rodriguez and Martinez in the drainage tunnel while he went back for the other wounded soldiers. It was a decision that went against every instinct Marcus had developed as a combat medic. Leaving critically wounded soldiers alone in enemy territory was the kind of mistake that could result in unnecessary deaths. But Marcus had no choice. Williams and Jackson couldn't be moved without assistance, and Martinez wasn't strong enough to help with the evacuation. Marcus would have to make the trip alone and hope that Rodriguez and Martinez could survive on their own until he returned. The journey back to the animal pens took Marcus through parts of the village he hadn't seen before. Taliban fighters were still conducting their search, but their efforts were becoming less systematic as darkness fell. Marcus used this to his advantage, moving through areas that the searchers had already cleared. When he reached the animal pens, Marcus found his teammates in worse condition than when he had left them. Williams was unconscious again, and Jackson was having difficulty staying awake. Both soldiers needed immediate medical attention that Marcus couldn't provide in the field. Moving two unconscious soldiers through hostile territory would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Marcus solved the problem by using techniques he had learned from moving injured livestock on his family's ranch. Using rope and improvised stretchers, he could drag both soldiers simultaneously while maintaining enough mobility to avoid enemy detection. The return trip to the drainage system took nearly 2 hours and required every survival skill Marcus had ever learned. He had to navigate by memory in complete darkness, avoiding enemy search teams while moving two soldiers who couldn't help with their own evacuation. Several times, Marcus had to hide in abandoned buildings or drainage ditches while Taliban patrols passed nearby. When he finally reached the drainage tunnel where he had left Rodriguez and Martinez, Marcus was exhausted and running on pure determination. But he had successfully gathered all 4 wounded members of his patrol, and they were now in a position to attempt the final evacuation. The drainage system provided a route to the edge of the village, but it wasn't designed for moving wounded soldiers. The tunnels were partially flooded, filled with debris, and barely large enough for one person to move through at a time. Getting 4 wounded soldiers through that system would require ingenuity, patience, and luck. Marcus organized the evacuation like a bucket brigade, with each soldier being passed from one tunnel section to the next. Rodriguez had regained enough consciousness to help with the process, and Martinez could provide assistance despite his leg injuries. Williams and Jackson had to be dragged through the tunnels while unconscious, a process that was both difficult and dangerous. The tunnel system was longer than Marcus had realized, and progress was slow. Several times, they had to stop and wait while Taliban search teams passed overhead. The sound of voices and footsteps filtering down through drainage grates was a constant reminder of how close they were to capture or death. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 90 minutes, Marcus saw starlight ahead. The tunnel was ending, and they were approaching the edge of the village. But Marcus's relief was premature. As they neared the exit, he could hear voices outside. The Taliban had anticipated that any surviving Americans might use the drainage system for escape, and they had posted guards at the exit points. Marcus faced his final tactical challenge of the day. He had 4 wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical evacuation, but the only route to safety was blocked by enemy forces. Fighting their way out would be impossible given their condition and limited ammunition. Hiding in the tunnels indefinitely wasn't an option because several of his teammates were critically injured. Once again, Marcus decided to break the rules. Instead of trying to fight or sneak past the guards, he would create a diversion that would draw them away from the tunnel exit. Using his last grenade and some improvised noisemakers, Marcus planned to simulate an American patrol approaching from a completely different direction. The plan required Marcus to leave his wounded teammates in the tunnel while he moved to a position where he could create the diversion. It was another decision that violated every principle of combat medicine, but it was also the only option that offered any hope of success. Marcus positioned himself about 200 meters from the tunnel exit and created a series of explosions and gunfire that simulated a firefight between American forces and Taliban defenders. The ruse worked perfectly. The guards at the tunnel exit abandoned their positions to respond to what they believed was an attack from the hills surrounding the village. With the exit clear, Marcus raced back to the tunnel and began moving his teammates to safety. One by one, he carried or dragged them out of the drainage system and up the hillside to a position that provided cover and concealment. By the time the Taliban fighters realized they had been tricked, all 5 American soldiers were hidden in the rocks above the village. But Marcus's challenges weren't over. His teammates needed medical attention that he couldn't provide, and they were still in enemy territory with no reliable means of communication. Standard protocol called for signaling for extraction using emergency beacons, but doing so would reveal their location to enemy forces as well as friendly aircraft. Marcus made one final decision to break military protocol. Instead of waiting for dawn to signal for extraction, he used his emergency beacon immediately, counting on the confusion in the village to mask their exact location. The signal would bring help, but it would also bring danger. The extraction helicopter arrived 45 minutes later, guided by Marcus's beacon and covered by attack aircraft that had been dispatched as soon as the patrol failed to report in. The pilot later said it was one of the most challenging night extractions he had ever attempted, landing in rocky terrain while under possible enemy fire. As the helicopter lifted off with all 5 soldiers aboard, Marcus looked down at the village where 12 civilians were sleeping safely because his patrol had broken every rule in the military handbook. Lieutenant Rodriguez would recover from her injuries and continue serving. Sergeant Martinez would need months of physical therapy, but would return to duty. Corporal Williams and Private Jackson would both survive their wounds and eventually return to their families. The after-action report on the mission created controversy throughout the military chain of command. Marcus's unconventional tactics had saved lives, but they had also violated established procedures in ways that made commanders uncomfortable. Some argued that the mission's success was due to luck rather than skill, while others suggested that Marcus's approach should be studied and possibly incorporated into training programs. Marcus himself never claimed that his methods were superior to conventional military tactics. He simply argued that unusual situations sometimes required unusual solutions, and that rigid adherence to doctrine could be just as dangerous as ignoring it completely. The 12 villagers who were rescued returned to their homes and rebuilt their community. Several of them later sent letters to Marcus through military channels, thanking him for breaking the rules that would have left them to die. Those letters became Marcus's most treasured possessions, more valuable than any military decoration he would later receive. Years later, when Marcus became a training instructor for combat medics, he would tell his students that the most important skill they could develop wasn't following procedures perfectly. It was knowing when to break the rules in service of a higher purpose. Survival, he would tell them, wasn't about following a manual. It was about adapting to circumstances that no manual could anticipate. The mission in the Afghan village became a case study in unconventional tactics and adaptive leadership. Marcus Chun proved that sometimes the difference between success and failure wasn't following the rules of survival, but knowing when those rules needed to be broken completely. In the mountains of Afghanistan, surrounded by enemies and facing impossible odds, a combat medic from Montana, showed that the most important survival skill was the wisdom to do everything wrong at exactly the right time.